Her husband left the black girl bleeding in the yard, abandoning her like trash while dust swirled around her broken body, and the giant cowboy rode away without looking back. The trembling girl lay forgotten in the dirt as townsfolk whispered she'd be buzzard food by morning, another expendable soul the frontier would swallow whole. But when the mountain man appeared at sunset, his weathered hands gentle despite their scars, he saw what others refused to see. The silent giant who'd spent years alone in the peaks recognized something burning beneath her wounds, a dangerous intelligence that could shatter more than hearts. Hidden in her blood-soaked dress were secrets that could destroy powerful men across the territory, documents that proved crimes reaching the highest levels of frontier society. Would the mountain man's protection be enough to keep her alive long enough to speak her truth, or would those hunting her ensure this forgotten girl stayed buried forever? Before we continue, comment where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will publish a story there. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty trading post as Celeste Morrison swept the wooden porch. Her calloused hands gripped the broom handle while her eyes scanned the legal notices posted on the bulletin board. She could read every word, though no one suspected it. Vernon Caldwell emerged from the post office, his heavy boots thundering against the planks. His wife kept her gaze down as he approached. 6 months of marriage had taught her when to look invisible. Inside their cramped quarters behind the trading post, Vernon spread papers across their small table. Celeste served him coffee while stealing glances at the documents. Her heart stopped. These were property deeds, dozens of them, all bearing fresh ink over older signatures. Vernon caught her staring. His eyes narrowed. She turned back to her washing, but it was too late. The damage was done. That evening, Celeste pretended to mend clothes by candlelight. Vernon had ridden out on business, leaving the papers scattered on the table. She moved closer. Her educated eye recognized what she was seeing immediately. Forged land deeds, falsified property transfers, claims that would strip families from their rightful homes across the territory. The signatures were crude imitations. The legal language was deliberately confusing to hide the fraud. Her pulse quickened. During her time working for Attorney Morrison back east, she had seen similar schemes. This was systematic theft on a massive scale. The door crashed open. Vernon stood silhouetted against the darkness. Celeste dropped the papers. Too late. His face twisted with rage. Vernon had always assumed he married an illiterate woman who would never question his activities. The truth shattered that illusion completely. He grabbed her wrist. She pulled away, documents scattering across the floor. Vernon's voice came out as a low growl. He had spent months building this operation. Every forged deed represented stolen wealth. Every falsified claim meant another family's displacement. Celeste backed toward the door. Her secret education suddenly felt like a death sentence. She had learned to read from Mrs. Morrison, the attorney's progressive wife who believed all people deserved literacy. Those hidden lessons in constitutional law and property rights now marked her for elimination. Vernon reached for his coat. His decision was made. The next morning he hitched their wagon with unusual care. Celeste sat beside him as they rolled toward the distant hills. She clutched a small bag containing the most damning documents, her only insurance. The wagon hit the rock at full speed. Celeste flew from the seat, landing hard against the rocky ground. Pain shot through her ribs and shoulder. Vernon climbed down slowly, checking her injuries with cold calculation. He unhitched the horses, mounted his stallion, gathered the scattered belongings, but left her bleeding in the dirt. The trading post came into view as Vernon rode back alone. Townsfolk gathered around him, listening to his tale of tragedy. A terrible accident. His poor wife thrown from the wagon. Too badly hurt to move. Nobody volunteered to help. The distance was too far. The effort too great. Her life held too little value in their calculations. Vernon accepted their condolences with practiced sorrow. Inside, he felt only relief. The problem was solved. The operation would continue. Hours passed. The sun climbed toward its peak as Celeste lay motionless in the dust. Her breath came in shallow gasps. Blood seeped into the dry earth beneath her. Buzzards circled overhead. The scavengers had already marked her for death. The sound of hoofbeats echoed across the prairie. A lone rider approached from the mountain pass. Tobias Whitmore had spent 15 years in the high country. The solitary mountain man rarely ventured into populated areas. Today, business called him to the trading post. He spotted the overturned wagon from a mile away. His weathered eyes took in the scene immediately. Fresh wheel tracks leading back toward town, scattered belongings, a woman's form lying still beside the wreckage. Tobias dismounted and knelt beside Celeste. Her injuries were serious but not fatal. Someone had left her here deliberately. As he lifted her carefully, she stirred. Her eyes opened briefly, meeting his steady gaze. In her delirium, Latin phrases spilled from her lips, legal terminology that no frontier woman should know. Tobias paused. Those were not the words of an illiterate settler's wife. This woman possessed education that someone wanted silenced. He secured her across his saddle and began the long journey to his mountain cabin. Behind them, the abandoned wagon stood as evidence of betrayal. Hidden in Celeste's clothing, the stolen documents waited to expose a conspiracy that reached across the entire territory. The trading post grew smaller in the distance as the mountain man carried his burden toward safety. Vernon's plan was already unraveling, though he would not realize it for days to come. In her fevered state, Celeste clutched the papers that could destroy dozens of powerful men. Her survival now threatened an empire built on stolen land and forged claims. The race between justice and elimination had begun. 3 days passed before Celeste's fever broke. She woke in an unfamiliar cabin surrounded by rough-hewn walls and the scent of pine. Sunlight streamed through a single window, illuminating rows of leather-bound books that lined wooden shelves. Tobias sat near the fireplace, mending a leather harness. His movements were deliberate and careful. When he noticed her stirring, he brought her water without speaking. Celeste struggled to sit up. Her ribs ached with each breath. The events at the wagon came flooding back. Vernon's cold eyes, the deliberate abandonment, the documents hidden in her dress. She felt frantically for the papers. They were gone. Tobias noticed her panic. He pointed to a neat stack on the nearby table. Every document was there, carefully preserved and organized. Her eyes widened. Most people would have discarded the papers as worthless. Tobias had recognized their importance. She studied his weathered face, trying to gauge his intentions. Mountain men rarely involved themselves in lowland affairs. Why had he saved both her and the documents? Tobias rose and selected a book from his collection. He placed it beside her bed. Constitutional Law of the Western Territories. The pages were well worn from frequent reading. Celeste stared at the volume. Her fingers traced the familiar binding. She had studied this exact text during her secret lessons with Mrs. Morrison. Without thinking, she opened to Chapter 7 and began reciting from memory. Property rights and territorial jurisdiction flowed from her lips in perfect legal language. Tobias leaned forward. His assumption was confirmed. This woman possessed extensive legal education. She stopped abruptly, realizing her mistake. The secret she had hidden from Vernon was now exposed to this stranger. Tobias sat back down. His expression remained neutral. In the mountains, he had learned that survival often depended on hidden strengths. He would not judge her for concealing her intelligence. Celeste made a decision. This man had saved her life and protected her evidence. She owed him the truth. The words came slowly at first. Her childhood in Massachusetts. The progressive minister's wife who believed education should know no boundaries. Secret lessons in reading, writing, and law while she worked in the Morrison household. She had absorbed constitutional principles, property law, and territorial statutes with remarkable speed. Attorney Morrison had often remarked that she understood legal concepts better than his clerks. When the Morrisons died in a carriage accident, Celeste had been forced west to survive. Marriage to Vernon had seemed like safety. Instead, it had become a trap. Tobias listened without interruption. Her story explained the fever dreams, the Latin phrases, and her careful handling of the documents. She picked up the stack of papers. Her trained eye immediately recognized the systematic fraud. Forged signatures on dozens of property deeds, falsified territorial claims that would displace legitimate homesteaders across 3 counties. The scope was staggering. Vernon had not been working alone. This operation required coordination with territorial officials, land commissioners, and local sheriffs. Celeste spread the documents across the bed. She began explaining the legal implications to Tobias. Each forged deed represented a family that would lose their home. Each falsified claim meant stolen wealth flowing to Vernon's criminal network. Her voice grew stronger as she analyzed the evidence. Constitutional violations, territorial law infractions, federal crimes that could trigger intervention from Washington. Tobias watched her transformation. The broken woman he had carried from the Prairie was becoming a formidable legal mind. Her expertise surpassed any frontier attorney he had encountered. She looked up from the papers. Vernon's abandonment suddenly made perfect sense. He had realized that his illiterate wife could actually destroy his entire operation. The documents proved crimes that reached the highest levels of territorial government. Land Commissioner Bradley's signature appeared on multiple falsified transfers. Sheriff Morrison had witnessed several suspicious transactions. Even Judge Patterson's seal appeared on questionable rulings. This was not simple fraud. This was systematic corruption that threatened the legal foundation of the territory itself. Tobias rose and walked to his window. The autumn territorial court session was scheduled to begin in 3 weeks. Traveling judges would hear cases from across the region. Evidence of this magnitude could reshape the entire legal landscape. Celeste followed his gaze toward the distant mountains. She understood his implication. The court session represented their only opportunity for justice, but presenting evidence would require legal standing. Frontier courts rarely allowed women to testify in complex property cases. Her race and background would create additional barriers. Tobias turned back to face her. His reputation in these mountains was built on honesty and fairness. During the mining disputes of the previous decade, he had refused bribes from both sides. His word carried weight with territorial officials. He could provide credibility for her evidence. She could provide the legal expertise to present it effectively. The partnership formed without words. 2 outcasts against a system designed to exclude them both. Celeste gathered the documents with renewed purpose. Her legal education, hidden for so long, would finally serve justice. The woman Vernon had left to die would become the instrument of his destruction. Outside, storm clouds gathered over the mountain peaks. The first snows would come soon, making travel difficult. They had limited time to prepare their case and reach the territorial capital. The race against winter and corruption had begun. The wagon site lay exactly as they had left it 2 weeks earlier. Tobias scanned the horizon while Celeste searched through the scattered debris. Her movements were careful and deliberate. The remaining documents had to be here somewhere. She found them wedged beneath the overturned wagon bed. A leather portfolio containing the most damning evidence of Vernon's operation. Property surveys that had been deliberately altered. Correspondence between territorial officials discussing illegal land transfers. Financial records showing systematic theft across multiple counties. Celeste spread the papers on a flat rock. The additional evidence completed the picture. This was not random fraud, but a coordinated criminal enterprise spanning years of operation. The altered surveys were particularly devastating. They showed how Vernon's network had systematically shifted property boundaries to steal prime farmland from legitimate homesteaders. Entire families had been displaced based on these falsified documents. Tobias kept watch while she documented each piece of evidence. His weathered hands gripped his rifle as dust clouds appeared on the distant horizon. Someone was approaching fast. 3 riders emerged from the heat shimmer. Vernon led them, his face twisted with rage. He had finally realized that Celeste might have survived and retrieved the evidence. Tobias helped Celeste gather the documents quickly. They mounted his horse and rode hard toward the mountain pass. Behind them, Vernon's group gave chase across the open prairie. The mountain terrain favored Tobias completely. 15 years in these peaks had taught him every trail and hiding place. He guided their horse through narrow passages that would force the pursuers to dismount and follow on foot. By nightfall, they had reached safety in a hidden canyon. Vernon's frustrated shouts echoed from the valley below before gradually fading into silence. Celeste examined the documents by firelight. The evidence now painted a complete picture of territorial corruption. Land Commissioner Bradley had personally approved dozens of fraudulent transfers. Sheriff Morrison had provided armed enforcement for illegal evictions. Judge Patterson had rubber-stamped questionable rulings without proper review. The financial records revealed the scope of stolen wealth. Over $200,000 in property had been illegally transferred through Vernon's network. Dozens of families had lost their homes and livelihoods to this systematic theft. Tobias studied her face as she analyzed the evidence. The broken woman from the wagon site had transformed into a formidable legal strategist. Her expertise would be crucial for presenting this case effectively. She looked up from the papers. The upcoming territorial court session would hear cases from across the region. Federal judges from back east would preside over the most serious matters. This level of evidence would definitely qualify for federal review, but presenting the case would require overcoming significant obstacles. Frontier courts operated under different rules than Eastern legal systems. Women rarely testified in complex property disputes. Her background would create additional challenges with conservative judges. Tobias had witnessed territorial court proceedings during the mining disputes. The federal judges were generally fair but demanded absolute proof for serious accusations. Half measures and circumstantial evidence would not be sufficient. The documents provided that proof in overwhelming detail. Forged signatures could be verified through handwriting analysis. Altered surveys could be compared with original territorial records. Financial transactions left clear paper trails connecting all the conspirators. Celeste began organizing the evidence into a coherent legal argument. Constitutional violations under the 14th Amendment, territorial law infractions involving property fraud, federal crimes including mail fraud and conspiracy to defraud the government. Her legal education provided the framework for presenting complex evidence clearly. Each document would be introduced with proper foundation and legal authority. Every argument would be supported by constitutional precedent and territorial statute. Tobias watched her work through the night. She possessed remarkable focus and analytical ability. Her arguments were becoming more sophisticated as she developed the case strategy. By morning, she had constructed a comprehensive legal brief. The evidence was organized chronologically to show the systematic nature of the conspiracy. Supporting documentation was cross-referenced and properly cataloged. Constitutional arguments were clearly articulated with appropriate legal citations. The case was ready for presentation. Now they needed to reach the territorial capital before the court session began. The journey would take 8 days through difficult mountain terrain. Early snowfalls were already blocking some of the higher passes. Weather delays could prevent them from reaching court in time. They broke camp and began the treacherous descent toward the main territorial road. Behind them, smoke from distant fires suggested that Vernon's network was mobilizing additional resources to stop them. Word of their survival was spreading quickly through the criminal organization. Too much money was at stake for them to reach court safely. Every mile toward the capital would bring increased danger. Tobias guided their horse carefully down the rocky slopes. His knowledge of these mountains remained their greatest advantage. He could avoid the main roads where ambushes were most likely. Celeste clutched the leather portfolio containing their evidence. These documents represented justice for dozens of displaced families. The systematic corruption that had stolen their homes and livelihoods would finally face legal consequences. The territorial capital lay somewhere beyond the distant peaks. Federal judges were waiting to hear their case. Justice was within reach if they could survive the journey. Vernon's network would throw everything into stopping them now. The final race had begun. The territorial capital emerged from the morning mist after 8 grueling days of mountain travel. Wooden buildings lined dusty streets where wagons and horsemen conducted the business of frontier government. The courthouse stood at the center of town, its federal flag announcing the arrival of traveling judges. Celeste and Tobias approached the imposing structure with careful steps. Her leather portfolio contained evidence that could reshape territorial law. His reputation would provide the credibility needed to present it. The courthouse clerk barely glanced up from his ledger when they entered. His dismissive expression suggested that their appearance did not meet his expectations for serious legal business. Celeste stepped forward and requested an audience with the presiding judge. Her articulate speech and formal language caught the clerk's attention immediately. This was not the typical frontier woman seeking simple justice. The clerk examined her more carefully. His skepticism was obvious. Women rarely appeared in territorial court with complex legal matters. Her background raised additional questions about her standing to present evidence. Tobias placed his hand on the counter. His weathered face and mountain clothing marked him as someone who lived by his word in harsh country. The clerk recognized his type and listened more respectfully. They requested a preliminary hearing to present evidence of territorial fraud. The clerk explained that such serious accusations required proper legal standing and documented proof. Half measures would not be acceptable to federal judges. Celeste opened her portfolio and displayed selected documents. The clerk's eyes widened as he recognized official territorial seals and signatures. This was not frivolous litigation, but potential federal crimes with substantial evidence. He directed them to wait in the outer chamber while he consulted with court officials. Other petitioners filled the wooden benches, their conversations revealing the usual frontier disputes over property boundaries and contract violations. An hour passed before the clerk returned. He had spoken with Judge Fletcher's assistant about their request. The judge would grant a preliminary review to determine if their evidence merited formal proceedings. They were escorted into a smaller chamber where court officials evaluated pretrial motions. The assistant clerk sat behind a polished desk while examining their initial documentation. Celeste presented her legal brief with confidence and precision. Her arguments were clearly structured and supported by appropriate constitutional precedents. The assistant clerk's expression shifted from skepticism to genuine interest. Her knowledge of territorial law impressed him immediately. She cited specific statutes and court decisions with remarkable accuracy. This woman possessed legal education that rivaled trained attorneys. The assistant clerk asked pointed questions about evidence authentication and witness testimony. Celeste responded with detailed explanations of their documentation process and corroborating sources. She explained how the forged signatures could be verified through handwriting analysis. Original territorial records would prove that the surveys had been systematically altered. Financial institutions could confirm the fraudulent transactions. The assistant clerk reviewed the evidence more carefully. The scope of alleged corruption was staggering. If proven accurate, this case would expose systematic fraud reaching the highest levels of territorial government. He made notes about the constitutional violations and federal crimes involved. Mail fraud charges would bring federal prosecution. Conspiracy allegations could implicate dozens of territorial officials. After 2 hours of questioning, the assistant clerk reached his conclusion. The evidence was substantial enough to warrant judicial review. Judge Fletcher would hear their preliminary arguments the following morning. Celeste felt a surge of relief and anticipation. Months of hiding her education and enduring Vernon's deceptions had led to this moment. The legal system would finally hear the truth about territorial corruption. That evening, they secured rooms at a modest boarding house near the courthouse. Celeste reviewed her arguments while Tobias kept watch for any signs of Vernon's associates. Word of their arrival had already reached the criminal network. Urgent messages were being sent to corrupt officials throughout the territory. Too much stolen wealth was at stake for them to present their evidence unopposed. The next morning brought disturbing news. Sheriff Morrison had arrived in town with several deputies. His official presence would complicate their efforts to present evidence safely. Celeste and Tobias approached the courthouse with increased caution. Armed men lingered near the entrance, their intentions unclear, but their interest obvious. Inside the building, tension was palpable. Court officials moved with unusual urgency, while whispered conversations filled the corridors. Their case had clearly generated significant attention. They were called into Judge Fletcher's chambers for the preliminary hearing. The federal judge's identity remained unknown until they entered the room. Judge Marianne Fletcher sat behind an imposing desk, her piercing eyes evaluating the petitioners before her. Her reputation for progressive legal interpretations had preceded her appointment to the territorial circuit. Celeste felt her confidence surge. A female judge would be more likely to accept testimony from a woman petitioner. Gender bias would be less of an obstacle than anticipated. Judge Fletcher examined their evidence with meticulous attention to detail. Her questions revealed sophisticated understanding of constitutional law and federal jurisdiction. She asked Celeste to explain the legal foundation for their accusations. The response demonstrated mastery of complex legal principles that impressed even the experienced judge. After reviewing the documentation thoroughly, Judge Fletcher made her decision. The evidence was compelling enough to warrant full judicial proceedings. Formal charges would be filed against the accused parties. The preliminary hearing had succeeded beyond their expectations. Justice was within reach. The formal proceedings began at dawn with the courthouse packed beyond capacity. Word had spread throughout the territory that systematic corruption would face federal judgment. Displaced families filled every available seat while territorial officials clustered nervously near the defendant's table. Judge Fletcher entered with commanding presence. Her black robes and stern expression silenced the murmuring crowd immediately. This federal judge had earned respect through years of principled decisions that prioritized law over political convenience. Vernon sat beside his hastily assembled legal team. His expensive attorneys had arrived from Denver with confidence that quickly evaporated upon reviewing the evidence against him. The documentation was far more comprehensive than anticipated. Celeste took her position at the plaintiff's table with Tobias beside her for moral support. Her neat appearance and organized materials projected competence that surprised many courtroom observers. This was not the typical frontier woman seeking simple justice. Judge Fletcher addressed the packed courtroom. These proceedings would determine whether systematic fraud had corrupted territorial land policies for personal gain. Federal jurisdiction applied due to mail fraud charges and constitutional violations. The prosecution began by calling Celeste as their primary witness. She approached the witness stand with steady steps, while hostile stares followed her movement. Vernon's supporters clearly hoped intimidation would undermine her testimony. Judge Fletcher administered the oath with particular emphasis on truth and legal consequences. Her tone suggested that perjury would bring swift punishment regardless of the witness's background or circumstances. Celeste began her testimony by establishing her legal credentials. She explained her education under Mrs. Morrison's guidance and subsequent work in Attorney Morrison's office. Her knowledge of constitutional law and property rights was demonstrated through precise citations. The courtroom atmosphere shifted as her expertise became apparent. Legal observers recognized sophisticated understanding that exceeded many frontier attorneys. This witness possessed genuine qualifications to analyze complex evidence. She methodically presented each piece of documentation while explaining its legal significance. The forged property deeds were compared with authentic territorial records to reveal systematic alterations. Handwriting analysis confirmed that multiple signatures had been falsified. Vernon's attorneys attempted to discredit her testimony by questioning her legal standing and educational background. Their challenges backfired as Celeste responded with increasingly detailed legal arguments that demonstrated mastery of territorial statutes. Judge Fletcher intervened when the defense attorneys became overly aggressive. The witness had established sufficient legal competence to present complex evidence. Personal attacks would not be tolerated in her courtroom. The financial records revealed the scope of stolen wealth with devastating clarity. Over $200,000 in property had been illegally transferred through Vernon's criminal network. Bank records confirmed fraudulent transactions involving multiple territorial officials. Land Commissioner Bradley was called to explain his role in approving questionable property transfers. His testimony became increasingly contradictory as evidence exposed his participation in systematic fraud. Several approved transfers clearly violated territorial statutes. Sheriff Morrison faced similar difficulties when questioned about his enforcement of illegal evictions. Multiple families testified that armed deputies had forcibly removed them from legally owned property based on forged documents. The pattern of corruption became undeniable as witness after witness confirmed systematic abuse of territorial authority. Legitimate homesteaders described losing their farms to fraudulent claims that enriched Vernon's criminal enterprise. Judge Fletcher examined each document with meticulous attention to legal detail. Her questions revealed sophisticated understanding of property law and constitutional principles. The evidence clearly supported federal charges against multiple defendants. Vernon finally took the witness stand in his own defense. His testimony immediately contradicted previously established facts about property transfers and financial transactions. The web of lies became increasingly complex and unbelievable. Celeste was permitted to cross-examine Vernon directly. Her legal training proved invaluable as she systematically exposed contradictions in his testimony. Each answer created additional problems for his defense strategy. She presented correspondence between Vernon and territorial officials discussing illegal land transfers. His signature appeared on multiple documents authorizing fraudulent property seizures. The paper trail was comprehensive and damning. Vernon's attempts to explain away the evidence became increasingly desperate. His claims that documents were fabricated fell apart under detailed analysis. Handwriting experts confirmed the authenticity of all presented materials. The defense team requested additional time to prepare counter-arguments. Judge Fletcher denied the motion after reviewing the overwhelming evidence presented. The prosecution had established their case beyond reasonable doubt. She addressed Vernon directly about the charges against him: systematic fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy to defraud territorial government, and violation of constitutional property rights under the 14th Amendment. Each charge carried substantial federal penalties. The displaced families watched intently as Judge Fletcher prepared to render judgment. Their stolen homes and destroyed livelihoods awaited justice through federal intervention. Years of suffering demanded legal accountability. Vernon's criminal network had underestimated both the evidence against them and Celeste's ability to present it effectively. Their assumption that an uneducated woman could be silenced had proven fatally flawed. Judge Fletcher reviewed her notes while considering the appropriate verdict. The evidence was overwhelming, and the legal arguments were sound. Federal law demanded justice for the systematic corruption that had plagued territorial development. The packed courtroom waited in tense silence. History was being made as federal authority confronted territorial corruption. The outcome would reshape land policy throughout the region. Celeste sat quietly at the plaintiff's table. Her mission nearly complete. The education she had hidden for survival had become the instrument of justice. Vernon's attempt to silence her had instead amplified her voice beyond his worst fears. Judge Fletcher rose from her bench with the weight of federal authority behind her words. The packed courtroom held its collective breath as she prepared to deliver judgment on the most significant corruption case in territorial history. Vernon Caldwell was found guilty on all charges: systematic fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy to defraud the territorial government, and violation of constitutional property rights. The evidence had proven his guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. His sentence reflected the severity of his crimes: 15 years in federal prison with full restitution required to all affected families. Every dollar stolen through his criminal network would be returned with interest calculated from the original theft dates. Land Commissioner Bradley received 12 years for his role in approving fraudulent property transfers. His abuse of territorial authority had enabled systematic theft across multiple counties. Federal oversight would now monitor all future land transactions. Sheriff Morrison was sentenced to 10 years for enforcing illegal evictions and intimidating legitimate property owners. His badge and authority had been weapons in Vernon's criminal enterprise. A federal marshal would assume law enforcement duties in the affected region. Judge Fletcher addressed the broader implications of territorial corruption. Federal oversight would be expanded to prevent future systematic fraud. All property transfers from the previous 5 years would undergo comprehensive review to identify additional victims. The displaced families erupted in celebration as justice was finally delivered. Years of suffering and stolen livelihoods had found legal remedy through federal intervention. Their faith in American law had been restored through this landmark decision. Celeste remained seated quietly while chaos erupted around her. The woman Vernon had left bleeding in the dust had become the instrument of his complete destruction. Her hidden education had evolved into a weapon more powerful than any gun. Judge Fletcher called for order and addressed Celeste directly. Her legal expertise and compelling presentation had impressed the federal court system. Such talent should not be wasted on frontier isolation. The judge offered Celeste a position as legal clerk in the territorial court system. Her demonstrated ability to analyze complex evidence and present constitutional arguments was exactly what frontier justice required. Federal expansion demanded qualified legal minds. Celeste accepted the position with quiet dignity. Her journey from abandoned victim to legal advocate was complete. The education she had hidden for survival would now serve justice throughout the territory. Tobias watched her transformation with satisfaction. The broken woman he had carried across the prairie had found her true calling. His protection had enabled her talents to reshape their entire legal system. Judge Fletcher announced additional reforms based on evidence presented during the trial. Property rights would receive federal protection against territorial corruption. Constitutional law would supersede local prejudices in all future proceedings. The courtroom gradually emptied as people returned to their communities with news of federal justice. Corrupt officials throughout the territory would face increased scrutiny. Systematic fraud would no longer be tolerated. Over the following weeks, Celeste established her legal practice in a modest office near the courthouse. Her first clients were the families displaced by Vernon's criminal network. Property restoration required careful legal work to untangle years of fraudulent claims. Tobias became her trusted investigator and partner in seeking justice. His knowledge of territorial geography complemented her legal expertise perfectly. Together, they could serve families across the vast frontier region. Word of their success spread quickly through settlement communities. Honest families facing legal challenges began seeking their assistance. Celeste's reputation for competence and integrity attracted clients from distant counties. Her legal briefs became models for frontier attorneys dealing with similar corruption cases. Federal judges praised her constitutional arguments and meticulous evidence presentation. The territorial legal system was improving through her influence. The winter snows melted into spring as their practice expanded. Each case reinforced Celeste's conviction that education and law could triumph over prejudice and corruption. Her hidden talents had found their proper purpose. Vernon's criminal network collapsed completely as additional arrests followed the original convictions. Federal investigators uncovered corruption reaching even deeper into territorial government than initially suspected. The cleanup would continue for years. Families began returning to their stolen lands as property rights were legally restored. Fraudulent claims were systematically reversed through careful legal process. Justice was slow but thorough in addressing every documented crime. Celeste's transformation amazed everyone who remembered her desperate condition at the wagon site. The woman left to die had become a respected legal advocate whose influence extended across multiple territories. Judge Fletcher appointed her as special counsel for property rights cases throughout the federal circuit. Her expertise would help prevent future systematic fraud while protecting legitimate homesteaders from corrupt officials. On quiet evenings, Celeste reviewed case files in her office while Tobias planned their next investigative journey. Their partnership had evolved into a formidable force for frontier justice. The education that Mrs. Morrison had secretly provided years earlier was finally serving its intended purpose. Knowledge and law were protecting the innocent while punishing those who abused their authority. Their office door bore a simple sign announcing legal services for all frontier families regardless of background or circumstances. Justice would be blind to prejudice while remaining vigilant against corruption. New cases arrived weekly as word spread about their success in complex legal matters. Each victory reinforced the principle that intelligence and dignity could overcome any systemic injustice. Celeste Morrison had found her place in the American legal system. The woman who had hidden her education to survive was now using it to transform frontier justice. Her story had become proof that truth and law could triumph over the darkest corruption. The prairie wind carried news of their work to distant settlements where other families faced similar challenges. Hope was spreading across the territory along with federal justice.